When I first start a still life, I like to start by thinking kind of abstractly and just getting in these shapes and seeing how these shapes relate to each other. I'm keeping things very two-dimensional and just kind of figuring out how does the positive space work versus the negative space, and how these different shapes interact with each other to kind of design a composition that I think will hold onto this vision throughout the entirety of the painting. I'm using just a few tones to separate the different shapes from each other, using a darker one, a light tone, using the background, and then maybe scumbling in something a little in between. And this is just to kind of break up the shapes a little bit, but I can still kind of figure out how they're relating to each other. And so it's just one step to kind of push it closer while I'm continuing drawing and looking at that abstract shapes. I'm making sure to respect the fat over lean principle with oil painting, and so I'm making sure to keep a minimal amount of oil or fat in the paint in these early stages, and I'm just kind of scumbling over either dry paint or with a little bit of a thinner and oil mix, and so it's not a heavy or bodied paint. It's a very thin layer that I'm scrumbling over, just tinting the surface of the canvas in this earliest stage. Even in an early stage, I can get the feel for the whole composition because I'm just massing in these general blobs. I'm just treating the apple as blobs of form, but I haven't actually articulated them, and so they lack the specificity that reads as an apple, but I still know exactly the area where I'm going to be working on it. I know how it sits into space and relates to everything else, so I can get a feel for a whole without actually having to dive in and render something completely and then realize, no, it's not going to work, and then have to redo that all. So I'm making sure that I build things up evenly, or relatively pretty evenly, so that I can keep pushing and pulling things around, and I don't have to dive into one area and then make major corrections early into the painting process. I have a really strong idea of how I want those directional lines to be, so how your eyes navigate this painting, even from the earliest stage. That I'm making sure I'm designing everything to the angles, which is kind of like an X I'm designing that points your eye to the middle glass and that middle apple that I want the focus of this composition to be. So I'm making sure that these diagonals work to direct your eye in that way, but that it's not too off-balanced or too symmetrical, that there's still kind of a dialogue and a rhythm that goes through it. And so these are all things that I'm figuring out and thinking about even in this earliest stage, when I'm just kind of blocking in the entirety of the composition. I'm also not focusing on getting it to look like the actual material that the object is made out of yet, because all materials react a different way with light hitting onto it. With metal, it reflects and absorbs a lot of the color that's around it, and so if there's areas of red and yellows, it will be reflected onto the metal. And there'll also be a bigger division between the highlights and the lights, because the highlights will really just pop off the surface. But I'm keeping everything kind of muted now, and so it gives the metal kind of a dingy look, but that's just because I'm setting it up for those future layers where I will have it pop on top of it. And the glass has a similar characteristic where the highlight can pop off way more than the lights that are next to it, and so there's this greater divide, but it doesn't, because it's transparent, it's reacting a lot different than a really opaque solid metal object would react. And so I'm making sure to try to figure out exactly what makes a certain material look like a certain material, so that even if the drawing is not 1000% correct, it can still read as glass, even if the glass container is slightly a different shape. Because the people that are looking at this finished painting, they're not going to be seeing my setup. And so, especially with a still life, you can get away with having subtleties that aren't perfect in terms of drawing, even though you might not lack the characteristic that makes the individual item exactly what it is. But with what I'm doing with this one is I'm not doing it exactly sight size, and I'm modulating things a little bit. So like with the glass in the center, I'm kind of shortening it up a little bit just so it fits into the composition better. And so I'm making these executive decisions to change some of the actual proportions of the object, because I like how it reads with the entirety and the actual composition, the layout of the canvas. And as long as you are consciously aware of the decisions you're making that's deviating from what you're doing, you can make those changes and have them work to improve your composition even better. When I do go through and put these highlights in, like on the metal, I have to be really careful on how I place them, because They are not just arbitrary, really bright points. They describe the form, and they're there. They exist in the place they do because of how you're optically looking at it, from the perspective you're looking at it, and the actual quality of the form of the object. And so misplacing those will completely mess up the feeling of roundness or solidity of an object. While I'm going back over these objects, especially the apple, I'm still only using a limited palette with just lead white, yellow ochre, English red, and ivory black. And later on in this painting, I'll incorporate a lead tin yellow, Naples yellow, and I believe a alizarin crimson for those dark, cool reds. But I'm keeping this very limited color palette so that everything harmonizes and works together, and so it all feels connected, even though there's a lot of differences in that. And when I do go through and start working with the lead tin yellow, I can actually take a clean brush and pick it up, and it's nice and stringy, and so I can take that and just really carefully place the bead of paint, mix it up on the palette to the exact color I want, and then place that bead onto the highlight and where I want it to direct the form, and so that it sits on top of all the paint and it really makes it glow. And I'm also using this lead tin yellow in the brightest apple, and it's so cool because unlike if you were to mix a yellow from mixing like a lead white and a yellow together, the lead white knocks down the intensity of the chroma. With lead tin yellow, it's bright like a lead white, but it contains the chroma already in it. And so you can get these really, really bright yellows, but it still holds the integrity of having a lot of chroma in it, so it can really make an object glow. And it's been one of my favorite pigments to use this summer. And sometimes I don't just like lay down the paint and leave it there. Sometimes I do if I get lucky and I place it down just perfect, but oftentimes I'll take another brush and kind of like rework the edges a little if there's an area that transitions, or if I don't like exactly how I laid it down. And you can just keep repainting it over until you get it to lay down or work exactly so it interconnects with everything else exactly how you want it to. One of the last things I do is I go back through the entire composition and work on that edge quality and find and contrast the areas where there's a really sharp edge quality to where there's a real gradual one. And so like with the apples, there's going to be a real subtle transition as the form turns back into space versus something that has like an abrupt edge that just kind of cuts off. And so I'm going through and really working on this edge because it's going to say a lot about the internal form of how the edges interact with the environment. I'm also making sure to push the things that are further back and make the edges a little bit softer and kind of blend in together a little bit more than the objects up close, like the book hanging over the edge. It's going to have these really abrupt, hard lines of the pages where it's catching the light, and it's going to make it stand in front of even just the actual book that's further back into space. So you can add these line variations even with the same object that's just going back further into space, and that's how you sit an object back into space and bring it forward. And that wraps up my still life. Then I just have to sign the work, frame it up, and it's ready to go. If you want to show your support, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any questions below. And thank you for following along my journey so far.